Hello and welcome to Ordinary Interesting People. I'm really excited to share this episode with you about Henry Tennyson Folkard. I had lots of fun researching him and his very artistic family. He was a passionate librarian who brought knowledge to working class people in the 19th century. But before we get into the story, a reminder that if you're a keen genealogist and you have somebody interesting in your family tree, if you let us know, we can try and make a video about your family member. Our story begins on Wednesday, the 21st of August, 1916. We're in a 3-storey home, 16 Swinley Road, in Wigan. Wigan is about halfway between Liverpool and Manchester in the northwest of England. In the entrance hall to the house stands a 65-year-old man in a suit. This is Henry Tennyson Folkard. He has a large moustache and he looks very smart as he checks himself in the mirror. He says goodbye to his wife Marion and then he sets off. It's about 10 a.m. and he lives about 20 minutes away from where he works at the Wigan Free Library. He's been head librarian there for about 39 years and he's incredibly committed to the role. So he arrives at work and he spends the morning working on one of his biggest projects, to collate all of the reference section of the library. This is a huge job at a time when there were no computers to help. He's currently about halfway through the W's, so he's nearly at the end of the catalogue. And the catalogue has over 5,000 pages of titles of books. He believes it's the largest municipal library catalogue in existence. Henry was a logical man who liked order, which made him a bit of an anomaly in his family. Henry had 3 sisters, and all 3 of them worked in the arts. His older sister was called Julia Bracewell Folkard, and she was a famous artist. She was a student at the Royal Academy, but they wouldn't make her a full member as she was a female. Despite that, she managed to win the silver medal for painting, and she became a portrait painter. You can see one of her paintings in the National Portrait Gallery. Julia never married. She became the head of her own household, and at times she lived with her sister Mary, other times with her sister Elizabeth, and also another artist, Emily Jane Harding Andrews, where they lived in St George's Square, St Pancras. Henry's sister Elizabeth was also an artist who exhibited at the Royal Academy. She then spent over 10 years working as a nurse, but in later life returned to art whilst living with her sister Julia. Their sister Mary Howard Folkard started out as an actress. She then spent some time as an elocutionist, and in the 1890s she became an author, writing under the pseudonym Mary H. Tennyson. All 3 of Henry's sisters chose not to follow traditional roles. They lived quite a bohemian lifestyle, which would have been quite shocking at the time. I tried to find out where these women got their artistic flair from. Their father, Henry Folkard, was a well-known surgeon, but I discovered that he wrote a drama called The Dyke House, and written inside the front of the play, it says, Mary Howard Folkard from her father. So perhaps that's where they got their artistic genes. One of the first records we have for Henry is the 1851 census, when he was just 4 months old. He's listed in the census as a visitor to a house in Chelsea, where lived a stonemason and his wife. I was very confused as to why a 4-month-old would be visiting on his own to this house in Chelsea. But then I realised that the wife was working as a monthly nurse. So a monthly nurse was there to help mothers with their babies after the birth. And it seems likely that Henry's mother was perhaps not well, and so they had taken the baby in, perhaps just for the night. Henry's older sister Julia is also not at home for this census. She's living with her grandmother Elizabeth and 2 of her cousins. Elizabeth ran a school and 2-year-old Julia is listed as a pupil. So it gives the impression that perhaps something is wrong with Henry's mother and the children are having to stay with other people at this time. When Henry was 10 years old, his mother, Julia, died aged 32. This left his surgeon father, Henry, with 4 young children in 1860. Henry Sr., being a busy surgeon, wasn't able to keep his children at home. And we find that our Henry was sent to a boarding school, the Chipping Norton National School. This wasn't a large boarding school with huge dormitories. Henry was boarding with just 3 other boys in the family home of his schoolmaster, Edward Hartley. The school focused on reading, writing, arithmetic, orthography, or spelling, dictation, and grammar. There were no art subjects at this school, which perhaps suggests why Henry became so enamoured with the world of order and books. His 3 sisters were all sent to live with their grandmother Elizabeth, and they all attended her school. The youngest, Mary, was only 5 years old when her mother died. It must have been so difficult for those 3 girls to have lost their mother, but at least they had each other and they had their grandmother with them, whereas Henry was sent off to live with strangers, and he would have been expected to have a Victorian stiff upper lip. By 1871, when Henry was 21, the family are all living together again in Chepstow Villas in Chelsea. The family were very wealthy. The house was huge with columns at the front. There was plenty of room for their grandmother, Elizabeth, to come and live with them. She was now 67 years old. At this point, his sisters were already studying art and music, and Henry was working as a clerk at St James Square, the location of the London Library. Whilst working at the London Library, Henry met Robert Harrison. He was a librarian and a writer, and in the 1840s, he travelled to Russia with his family to tutor a Russian prince. Robert had 4 daughters. One of them, May, married the famous artist and children's book illustrator Gordon Frederick Brown. And one of his other daughters, who was born in St. Petersburg, was Marion, Henry's wife. Marion was working as a telegraph instructor at the library, and that would have been where she met Henry, and the pair got together. After spending some time as a sub-librarian at the Royal Academy of Arts, in 1877, Henry was offered the post of Head Librarian at the brand new Wigan Free Library. Nowadays, most of us are lucky enough to have a library within walking distance of our house. But in 1877, most people didn't have free access to books. So the opening of a new library was a big deal. The Wigan Free Library was funded by Thomas Taylor, who was a local cotton mill owner. He gifted £5,000. The library was built on the site of the old grammar school, and it was designed by the architect Alfred Waterhouse. It's a huge, imposing brick building with vaulted ceilings, and it still stands today. It is now the Museum of Wigan Life. So Thomas Taylor had provided the money to build the building and to pay for the land, but by far the biggest expense was the books. A surgeon, Joseph Taylor Wynnard, had left money in his will to purchase books for the library. They were hoping for £30,000, but after admin, they were left with only £11,000. This seemed like a huge amount of money to me if £5,000 had built the whole library, but books were very expensive. A typical hardback book which would be bought for the library would cost 31 shillings, which is more than the average weekly wage. The job of purchasing the books was given to Gerard Finch, who was a barrister, and he was the person who chose Henry Folkard to become the head librarian. So Henry and Marion left their fairly luxurious lifestyle in London and moved to Wigan, a very working class town. After lots of work purchasing the books and arranging them in the library was opened in May 1878. The whole town was excited. The event was so big that many businesses closed early. The streets were covered in bunting and other decorations. They had Venetian masts with streamers coming off them. And there was a stage with a big sign that said, "Welcome to Thomas Taylor, Esquire." They also had a big procession with the mayor and mayoress. There were lords and ladies, MPs and clergymen. And the procession was accompanied by the music of the Rifle Volunteer Band. A quote from one of the newspapers said, All along the route, the streets were lined with spectators, and the croft was crowded with sightseers. The mayor and party then ascended the platform, hearty cheers being given by those present, and the presentation ceremony commenced. It must have been exciting for Henry to have been a part of bringing knowledge and learning to the people of Wigan. In that same year, Henry and Marion were married, and Henry threw himself into Wigan life. He joined the 21st Lancashire Rifle Volunteers, which was later known as the 5th Manchester Territorial Army. He volunteered for them for many years. These territorial armies were some of the first groups of people to be sent to the front during World War I. So a few years later, in the 1881 census, we find Henry and Marion living at Thornhill. They have 2 children, Henry Easter and Ella Frieda, and they have a cook living with them named Elizabeth. It's a nice middle-class street. Other people living on the street are cotton mill managers, people living from independent means, and mechanical engineers. And on the same street lives Eva Shaw, who was one of the library assistants. Henry was a fairly important member of the community as the head librarian. We know from a report that he was invited to a celebratory breakfast at Standish Hall when the new High Sheriff of Lancashire was appointed. This was Nathaniel Eckersley, who is the same man who began the 21st Lancashire Rifle Volunteers. By 1891, they were living at 8 Collins Street. They now have 5 children, and they have a live-in governess called Edith Hayward. Number 8 Collins Street is quite a modest-sized house for quite a big family, which must have been a change from what they were both used to. Henry was known for his record keeping. He was meticulous, and every year he wrote an annual report with statistics for every possible thing you could think of regarding the library. In 1899, he wrote his 21st annual report, and we find out information like the fact that they have 51,195 volumes in the library. They'd had 974 new borrowers that year. He even recorded the occupations and ages of every borrower. I was interested to see the statistics for the number of visits from boys versus girls. There were 30,027 visits of boys to the library, but only 2,994 visits for girls. By this point in history, it was acceptable for women to read novels, but they weren't encouraged to read the news or non-fiction. It certainly wasn't seen as important for girls to be educated to that level. By 1899, Henry's reference catalogue was already up to letter L, and we discover that Henry is hoping for electric lighting to be put into the library, as he felt like the present lighting system damaged the books. Just a few years later, in 1901, still living at 8 Collins Street, Henry's daughter Ella has now become a schoolmistress, and in an article about Henry, it describes him as a zealous librarian. He seems to be incredibly efficient, and he's constantly making improvements to make the library better. For one, he's got his electric lighting, which he's very happy about. And he had also become a member of the Society of Antiquaries. To become a member of the Society of Antiquaries, you have to have made a significant achievement in archaeology, antiquities, history, or heritage. Henry often worked with people from other professions to support the library in its work. By 1911, the family have moved to Wingates. This is a 13-roomed house on a quiet country road. It formed part of a large estate in the area. Henry's family were all doing well. His daughter Muriel was now also working as a high school mistress, and his son Henry is working in the civil service. His daughter Hilda was training to be a nurse in Liverpool, and Ella had got married and had a child. Dorothy had married a foreman at a cotton dyeing factory, and she lived nearby. So around this time, rates were reduced for library funding, which had a huge effect on the libraries. Nowadays, all of the library funding comes from the council, from our council tax. But back then, people had to pay a specific rate to fund the library. And the effects can be seen if we read the report for 1913. Henry was very unhappy about the reduced funding, and he points out that across the whole year they've only been able to buy 44 new books in the lending library. The books were dilapidated and dirty, which meant that they were losing borrowers. He says, "Through these causes we have lost many of our borrowers to the cinematograph shows in the town." The new cinema perhaps looked a lot more exciting than some old tatty books. But the report shows how much Henry cares about this library and how much he wants it to do well in the community. By this point, he's already completed letter T of his reference catalogue, and he started on the letter U. In the report for 1914, we discover that Henry cares about all library users. The library is subscribed to the Braille Library in Manchester, and every week they have readings for blind library users. Henry also suggests that they could create a mobile library service for blind and disabled users who couldn't physically attend. Despite having worked at the library for so long, his passion doesn't seem to have faded. He wants to reach as many people as possible. And of course, a report for 1914 wouldn't be complete without mentioning the war. He writes, "I have again to record a decrease in the issues in almost all the departments, which I attribute partially to the disturbing conditions throughout the country owing to the war, and the consequent enlistment of many of our male readers and students." And in fact, on the 11th of December 1915, his own son, Henry, was enlisted. He joined the Royal Garrison Artillery as a gunner, and after training he was posted out on the 2nd of May 1917. We learn from Henry's records that he developed albuminuria, a sign of kidney disease. This was common during World War I. A virus called hantavirus, which was carried by rodents, would cause something called trench nephritis, and one of the side effects of that was albuminuria. Henry was awarded a 40% pension as a result, but he did survive the war. I got the impression that for Henry, World War I was an inconvenience for his work at the library. In one of his reports, he's talking about adding metal shelving, and he says, "I hope that further provision will be made immediately after the war to keep pace with the growing demands of the library." He's also still committed to making his reference catalogue, and he mentions that he's up to the word Wigan, and he says, "The catalogue has already reached 5,000 printed pages, and I think I may reasonably hope that 2 more volumes will finish my magnum opus." Which brings us back to the 21st of August 1916. Having worked on his magnum opus all morning, he decided to go home for lunch. At about 1:15, he was walking along Standish Gate, and he came to Mains Street. As he was about to cross, further up Main Street was a milk float driven by a 14-year-old called Benjamin Clifton Elliot. Milk floats at this time were large wagons with huge wheels, and they were driven usually by quite large horses. There were some carts between Benjamin and Henry, and when the carts moved on, Henry went to cross the road, not realising that Benjamin was coming towards him. The boy saw what was happening. He shouted at the horse. He pulled hard on the reins to try to get the horse to slow down. Unfortunately, it didn't stop in time. The wheel shaft collided with Henry's leg, knocking him down. The wheel went right over his foot, and he fell backwards, and his head hit the metal step. Henry lay motionless on the ground. He was immediately taken to Dr. McElligot's surgery, and then from there to Wigan Infirmary. He arrived there about 3 o'clock. Henry was unconscious. He had a large swelling on the right side of his forehead, and he was vomiting blood. His left toe was blackened and swollen, and his skull was fractured. Henry never gained consciousness, and he never got to finish his magnum opus. He died on Friday the 23rd at 7:45 p.m. The town of Wigan mourned. There were multiple obituaries in the newspapers, and his funeral was attended by the mayor, the councillor, members of the Freemasons, of which he was also a part, his colleagues, and many other library staff from the region. and of course his family. He never got to see his reference catalogue completed, but he did make it possible for thousands of Wigan residents to study, to learn, and to enjoy reading. I particularly loved researching this story, as Henry struck me as a man who wasn't interested in glory or reward. He worked tirelessly and quietly because he had a passion. If you've enjoyed this story too, consider liking and subscribing to the channel, which encourages us to make more videos. Contact us at ordinaryinterestingpeople@gmail.com with details of any ordinary interesting people that you would like to see featured in an episode. Thank you for watching.